My name is Simon Burrell. I'm Director of Involve, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our Creative Councils webinar. Let me tell you just very briefly about Involve, and then I'll tell you how this is all going to work. Some of you will have been on it already, and others will be new to the webinar. So Involve is a charity based in London, and our work is to promote and support public engagement. We work with both government and communities, local government and national government, to support public engagement, to help people to do it better, with the purpose of trying to make decision-making more effective and the delivery of services more efficient. That's the kind of short blurb about Involve. And sorry for my stuttering, it's quite strange looking at a computer screen and not seeing everybody's reaction. The organiser of this is down on your screens as Annie, but Annie is actually away today. So when you hear a male voice coming in, that's Tim, and Tim is actually pretending to be Annie today. So this is the third webinar in our series on community engagement for NESTA's Creative Councils programme. And if you're interested in the other two, they're available, recordings of them are available on our website, and we'll be putting up a recording of this one as well shortly after it finishes. So Creative Councils is a programme from NESTA and the local government group, currently working with 17 councils to develop and implement radical innovations that meet the challenges of tomorrow. And the purpose of these webinars is to support and strengthen that programme of work. So today's session, and I hope you're all in the right one, today's session is looking at elected representatives and community engagement. And this is a subject we're really extremely lucky to have Mary Reid here with us to talk about. Mary has been a councillor, was a councillor from 1997 until 2010. She represented the ward of Chessington North and Hook in the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames. And during that time she served as mayor and held executive portfolios for children and young people's services and participation in communication. And Mary has a lot of experience in this area of digital and community engagement. She's got a deep interest in e-government and e-democracy in particular, and is currently chair of edemocracy.org, edemocracy.org, a US-based international organisation that fosters neighbourhood forums and other online projects for democratic innovation. Mary's going to give you a number of different chances during the presentation and afterwards open for discussion. So when Mary opens the discussion, or indeed if she says something and that sparks a thought, please raise your hand. And you do that not physically, but by clicking the button that you'll see with your hand. And then when the moment comes, we'll unmute you. And if we have a number of different hands raised, we will get to you. Tim, aka Annie, will be able to see who's got their hand raised, and we will come to you and we'll unmute you. And during the presentation, you can also message your questions. So you can use the chat function to message your questions and comments to Tim, who will then repost them so that everybody can see them, and we can then start a discussion going. And if you've got any problems in hearing me, in seeing the slides or whatever, also post that to Tim, and he'll try and help. If you are tweeting, the hashtag for today's session is #CreativeCouncils. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mary. Mary, thank you very much for taking the time to come in, and really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Right, well, thank you, Simon, and thank you for that introduction. You've obviously been reading my website. I would like to add just a couple of things to the things you said. One is that I did actually stand down in 2010. I wasn't defeated. It's quite important for politicians. I'm still politically active, but in a wider arena now. And another thing that wasn't mentioned was that for quite a while I held a role as chair of a neighbourhood. And that's something I'm going to be referring to later on in my presentation. Now, as Simon said, I'm planning to stop on several slides on the way through and ask for comments and questions, but this isn't one of them. I'm trying to move on to the next slide, and it's not actually doing that for me. Perhaps somebody can give me some technical assistance. While we're doing that, I will tell you a little bit about Kingston. Right, that has been sorted out. A picture of Kingston. It has some pretty wealthy areas, but otherwise it is a typical outer London borough. But it's also Oh, my apologies there. Right, it's also a home to something known as the Cambridge Road Estate. And if that picture on the right-hand side looks familiar, it's because it was used regularly in filming the Bill. Whenever they wanted something looking pretty rough, they came to Kingston, which may surprise some of you. How was Kingston and Involve involved together? Well, I was chairing a working group of councillors and officers who were developing new methods of participation around a specific issue. And I brought in Involve, who helped us work towards a good solution. And then they led a consultation session for us. They then came in and trained the officers so that they could use those techniques themselves in the future. And that was the beginning of a very helpful and useful relationship. Can I forward this, Tim, without... Right, the topics that I will be looking at through today will be, first of all, what motivates councillors. And I'll be looking at that very much from the perspective of a councillor and how they relate to officers in local government, and then suggest some structures and strategies that I've been involved with that support public engagement. So that'll be quite a personal account of things that I've found to work. They may or may not be relevant to you, but I hope you'll get something from that. So what motivates councillors? Let's try and get inside the mindset of somebody who has been elected as a local representative. Why do they stand for office? What makes them tick? And suggest several things. First of all, you'll find most councillors will say this: I want to improve things for local residents. Most councillors are genuinely motivated by a desire to give something back to their community. Whatever the public perception is, my experience is that that is the case. But there is the reality of political life. Is that hidden behind everybody else's view? Hopefully you can all see that. What it says there is, I want to be re-elected. And this really is what political life is about. Councillors are driven to understand their electors' wants and to do the best for them, because that's the best way to get elected again. Lots of councillors will say that they want to improve the public perception of councillors. I can't tell you the number of times on the doorstep people have said to me, all politicians are corrupt. To which I say very sweetly, but I'm a politician. Oh, I don't mean you, love, they say. Plenty of research has shown that though politicians in general are poorly perceived, someone who's known personally is thought of much more highly. There are, in fact, very low levels of corruption amongst councillors. And that's thanks to a political system that we have, which means people are watching each other, the opposition, like hawks. I don't know how many of you read Private Eye and look at the Rotten Boroughs page every couple of weeks. They usually have 4 or 5 stories there. And these often cycle around the same dozen or so characters. If there was more out there that was happening, I'm sure it would come to the surface. In fact, I've only once, in all my time involved with local governments, come across what I would consider a corrupt practice by a councillor, and that was dealt with, and it was a relatively minor one. It is very unusual. But it is very dispiriting for a councillor who's been struggling with a difficult decision, say something on planning quite typically, to find that people think they've taken a backhander. Residents also seem to think that councillors put in huge expenses claim. I wonder where they got that idea from. And they're shocked when they hear actually how small our allowances are and how little is actually available inexpensive. And yeah, that's a fairly obvious statement. Councillors want to be associated with popular and successful initiatives. But there are barriers, there are problems. And I expect you've come across councillors who've said some of these things. I'm elected to represent the residents, so I don't need to consult them between one election and the next. And I'm afraid this is an attitude that's still held by some councillors, especially those who are in safe seats. I don't like confrontation. Now, it's true that many councillors are pretty assertive, they enjoy a political scrap, but some would much prefer a consensual approach. And they worry that consultation, engagement, will actually polarize opinion and lead to rows. What I think we all need to do is to show them that good engagement actually reduces conflict, doesn't exacerbate it. Yeah, there are quite a lot of councillors who've been elected unexpectedly. They put their name down as paper candidates, and this is the reality of elections. Sometimes the wrong people get elected. Some councillors are much better suited to doing the role, some have more time, some are more willing than others, and I'm sure you can identify in your own councils people who have got in unexpectedly and then really don't do much and are not very effective for the next 4 years. There's an issue around the use of technology. This is perhaps understandable, especially amongst older members, and we do know, of course, that the average age of councillors is far too high. It's clearly best overcome by a bit of political persuasion. I often tell councillors, did you realise that 50% of your electorate on Facebook, that's where you need to be? Some training is clearly helpful to take that forward. And then there's the backbencher. And this was particularly prominent during the time when councils had moved to a cabinet system or an elected mayor system. Backbenchers began to feel very removed from the decision-making processes and felt they were unable to act effectively for their residents. I will suggest some ways in which that can be ameliorated later in this webinar. But for the moment, I think this would be a good point to take a slight pause and ask if any of you feel that this represents the councillors that you have, or whether any of it, or whether there are other reasons that motivate councillors, or indeed other barriers to them being effectively motivated. So, can anybody want to join in at that point?
So if you raise your hand if you have a question, and I will unmute you.
Mary, while people are just working out where their hand is and thinking about it, I was kind of, where would we go to find, where would people go to find out, I mean, is there somewhere that people can go to find out kind of quite fine-grained data about where constituents in their area, which social media they're using? And because you said 50% on Facebook, and I'm sure that's not the same across every ward. Is there fine-grained data like that or not?
I'm not completely aware of that. I've certainly seen data in the past which go at a level of boroughs. Not seen anything. It may well be there. I'd be very interested to hear if somebody can point me towards that. But even if the variation is from, say, 30% to 90%, that 30% is still pretty important, isn't it?
So Paul Bumstead has a question, so I'll just unmute you now, Paul.
Hello, Paul.
Oh. Hello there. Hello there.
Hello, Paul.
Right. A couple of things that you said, Mary. One is the social media bit, and you've quoted the 50% on Facebook. which means by my calculations there's at least 12.5% on Twitter, which is also a very, very useful tool for local authorities, for councillors. But the other side of it is, I think one of the major problems is the politicisation of local government. It is confrontational. If you're a Liberal Democrat, if you're a Conservative, if you're Labour, and a different party is in power, how do you get your voice properly heard? And from that point of view, how can you really start to represent what your constituents, what your voters want you to do?
Is anybody else wanting to say anything there?
There's nobody else so far, so...
That is something that concerns me greatly, and I'm sorry to keep referring to later on in the presentation, but I will be looking at some strategies which actually mean that the ward councillor becomes much more prominent in making decisions about the things that affect their ward. And I certainly take your point about Twitter. Of course, that's another social medium which is of increasing importance at the moment.
John has just responded to me via the chat. John, would you like to read out your piece? John, are you there? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just saying you could find out data about Facebook users in a particular location by signing up to run a Facebook advert. You can get the details without actually going through the whole process and buying the advert. As you go through the process, it will, if you set a location, it will tell you how many users there are within certain distances of that location, and it will also divide them up into age groups and interests if you want that information too.
Oh, that's really, really helpful. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you. Good bit of advice there.
Would anybody else like to come in at this point? If you raise your hand and I will unmute you. I think that's it by the looks of it at the moment. So, Mary, would you like to continue?
Okay. The next couple of slides look at, in more depth, at why councillors and council officers might want to use the kind of participation tactics that we've been talking about in this project, and why would they want to engage with local residents. And I think these are all, I guess you would all pretty well agree with this. Up at the top, we want to have evidence-driven decision-making. So engaging consulting helps to produce the evidence that we need. We want to have sustainable outcomes. So we want outcomes that have been tested up against the people who are likely to benefit from them, or indeed who might not like them. And so hopefully that way we will get outcomes which actually are going to last. We're also going to get more popular ones, slightly different point, where there's good public perception of the results of what we're doing. And then there's also something around crowdsourcing and the wisdom of the crowd. If you ask people their views, you may well get some additional ideas, suggestions, pointers, which the people who are too close to the issue perhaps haven't noticed. So the idea here is that by engaging, you're going to help solve problems more effectively and more efficiently. And I think there's agreement around those between councillors and council officers. And I've got another but coming up, because I believe that councillors, though, have some additional reasons why they want to use public engagement. And I think it's important that officers understand that these are also driving councillors. So the top one is, I want to please my electors. yeah, I want to keep in with them. I want to do the things that they are happy with. It raises my profile, especially if there's a good bit of publicity around whatever decision is made. And it's democracy. Local government is government, not just a local provider or commissioner of services. Councillors do see themselves as the custodians of democracy, whereas I do know that there are some officers, none of you of course, who think that the government aspect of local government actually interferes with the delivery of public services. And then finally, it fits in with my political philosophy, and that's not to be dismissed lightly. The fundamental principles that underline the political parties are hugely significant for quite a lot of councillors, but not for all of them. Some councillors, although they've gone in on a party ticket, have really drifted into a particular party because somebody asked them. They're much more interested in just being involved in the community, but actually have not bought into the philosophy of that particular party. So it's important that people understand that that reason over on the left does not apply to everybody. People who are quite political animals, though, do understand that politics is about pragmatics. It's about achieving the best that you can in line with your principles, but in the light of the need to negotiate and compromise. They won't follow the party line simply because they're told to do so by their leaders. Most political groups will debate policy and strategy quite heatedly and then come to an agreed position. And they will probably also have a protocol for handling dissent, especially on issues of conscience. So once again at that point, if anybody wants to come in with any comments about how council officers and councillors may view engagement strategies in slightly different ways and from a different perspective, it'd be very interesting to hear your comments on that.
Would anybody like to come in at this point? Nobody so far, Sue.
Okay. Just a quote. Councillors are elected by, I know you can read, it just gives me a pause to take you through this slide. Councillors are elected by and represent their residents. So it is in their interest to find out what the residents want and try to make it happen. Mustn't forget that is always a key thing that they're thinking about. I want to move on to think a little bit about the kind of different techniques for public engagement that we might use depending on the size of the project we're talking about. And these two pictures show a couple of projects in the centre of Kingston. On the left, a major shopping centre, pedestrianisation of a street, huge economic development. And on the right, a flatbed fountain installed in the market square. Now, it'd be interesting to think about which of those two projects generated the most public discussion. And interestingly enough, it was the one on the right, the flatbed fountain. Some projects will be larger than others in terms of their scope because they are more universal or as opposed to appealing only to special interest groups. Or they might be large and small in relation to the geographical area they affect. Or they might simply be large or small in relation to the costs of the project. And when under my portfolio, actually, the consultation strategy for Kingston was reviewed some years ago, and I looked at the first draft of the policy document, I realized that they had limited it to only to large consultations. They said that the small consultations did not come under their remit and they would not be issuing guidance for them. And I actually insisted that was changed around and that guidance was available on running consultations about projects at all levels. You see, often the large consultations are carried out by professional PR people, by people with real expertise in communications within the council, whereas the small local consultations are often carried out by engineers who have no training or expertise in communications. Now, believe me, I'm not knocking engineers here, I'm one myself, but their training will not have encompassed the skills of engaging properly with the public. But it's those small consultations which cause the most angst to councillors. And they're the ones that can often go seriously wrong, and they're the ones that actually get local residents much more agitated than the much bigger ones. So just a reminder there that small projects are just as important, if not more important to councillors as large ones, because they are the ones that really capture the interest of the voting public. You'll find that far more residents are interested in a road calming scheme, a traffic calming scheme in their road, or a parking scheme, especially if they don't like it, than something like the long-term economic development of the town, which they're happily to hand over to other people. So when these small projects go wrong, councillors can be very vulnerable. Right, the next slide shows a very familiar project cycle. My question here is, at what point does public engagement fit in? And my answer would be, at every stage. Starting with identifying the problem. Early engagement will actually pick up problems in the first place and will help to identify them and the scope of the problem at that point. Informing and consulting residents, clearly there's some engagement going on there. There's a need there, of course, to explain the constraints around a proposal or a project. Maybe financial constraints, maybe constraints about the scope of the project and what it's actually supposed to be dealing with. And then at the point of making a decision, should there be resident participation at that point? Should the residents make the decision? These are serious questions we should be thinking about. The next point, of course, and I'm sure you're all aware, feedback to residents is often the bit that is missing. Councillors, of course, use political channels to provide feedback through their leaflets and what have you. But that, of course, does not let the councils off the hook. They should be providing feedback to residents, and it's surprisingly rare, in fact, that it happens. And finally, monitoring. How much formal monitoring goes on around a project that's been through the cycle? In practice, of course, it will be the residents who will be quick to alert people to any problems that have arisen. Now, as we know, sometimes this is an iterative process. So my next question is, where do the councillors fit into this? Are they involved in every stage as well? Do they leave it all to officers? Are they actively involved? Why? Why should they be actively involved at all those stages? Or should they be? So again, there may be some comments or questions that people might want to bring up at that point.
So would anybody like to come in at this point? If you just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. If you'd like to make a comment at any stage and don't want to read it out yourself, you can post it in a message to me and I'll read it out for you at some stage.
Okay, I'll move on, but I'll leave you with this thought. Feedback to the residents is absolutely crucial, because that's how the residents get to know what they've been up to. So let's move on to the next phase of this session, which is about structures and strategies that support public engagement. I'm going to be, as I said, reflecting on my own experiences in Kingston. Some of this may be relevant to you, some not, but hopefully you might be able to pick up some ideas. And this is what we need to try to do. We want to find approaches that allow people to work cooperatively towards the best solution. And the people here does include the three strands: councillors, officers and residents. We want to reduce confrontation and aim for consensus. Remember those councillors who are worried that engagement might actually polarize people and create more conflict than would be if they didn't consult. We need structures and approaches that are accessible, relevant and interesting to residents. Interesting is important. If they're bored, they won't get involved. We want something that makes best use of ward councillors and, of course, are effective and efficient. And the first thing I want to look at are area committees. They differ, of course, from parish councils. Parish councils are separately elected. Area committees are made up of councillors who've been elected to that particular tier of government. They tend to work best in unitaries and in metropolitan boroughs. I'd be interested to hear of examples of good practice in other structures as well. They effectively give us a devolved structure within the tier of government. And I want now to look particularly at how we manage this in Kingston. In fact, we got in on the Act rather a long time ago and used the term neighbourhood committees. And so when I'm talking about neighbourhood committees, I'm talking about this very specific sense of a subcommittee of a council which is focused on a particular area within the council. In fact, I'd just seen, yesterday as it happens, a friend passed over to me when he was clearing out some cupboards, a policy paper for Kingston from 1986, in which the very first thing it talked about was participation, increasing participation through some sort of neighbourhood structure. In fact, they weren't actually introduced until 1994, but not as an extra layer, which was one of the models that was being looked at. Instead, the existing ward councillors form the neighbourhood committee. So you can see a map there of Kingston. It's divided into 4 neighbourhoods, each neighbourhood consisting of 3 to 5 wards, and the ward councillors for all of those wards within a neighbourhood sit on the neighbourhood committee. There was initially some opposition to this politically. Perhaps at this point I ought to explain my political allegiance only for the sake of clarity, actually, rather than to use it in any polemical way. So I've come from a Liberal Democrat position, and the opposition in 1986 were the Conservatives, and they were initially opposed to it, quite loudly opposed to it. I will have to say that over the next 2 or 3 years their attitude did change dramatically, so that they now are fully supportive of it, especially as they realised that when in opposition they would still be controlling one or more of the neighbourhoods, which is what's happened at the moment. So there has actually been a very supportive approach to this across all the parties, and Labour as well, although they currently don't have any councillors in Kingston, but when they did, they were very supportive of it. And we found that any later developments of the neighbourhood system has always been done cooperatively between 3 parties. So they have been looking at how it would work for them both in control and in opposition. Now, the important thing about neighbourhood committees is they maximise the role of all ward councillors. And to indicate how significant we think neighbourhoods are, Kingston actually pays an allowance to the chairs of neighbourhoods, which is exactly the same as the allowance paid to cabinet members. Through the neighbourhood system, the focus is on hyper-local consultation, contacting everybody who's affected by a problem, discussing solutions, and doing it in a very accessible way. So these are the areas of responsibility in our neighbourhoods: traffic and highways, parking, planning applications up to a certain point. In fact, planning applications which are seen as strategic or have an impact on a wider area than the neighbourhood itself, or which are large, over so many dwellings, those ones actually still go to a central development control committee. But all the others are decided by at neighbourhood committee level. Parks and open spaces and libraries. In fact, the policy is DevoMax, devolving as much as possibly can. The principle is everything will it's actually that of subsidiarity. You know, anything that can be devolved is devolved. There has to be a reason for keeping it at the centre. So the neighbourhood committees act as both planning authorities and highways authorities. We found there's absolutely no need for any restructuring within the council itself. There's no need for mini town halls or completely separate teams of officers. We have a neighbourhood manager for each neighbourhood, and the neighbourhood managers work together as a team and share good practice with each other. We did insist on having a lead neighbourhood planning officer and a lead traffic engineer for each neighbourhood. But otherwise, they're working with their teams and drawing on the expertise across the whole council workforce. There's also, as you'll see, a neighbourhood improvement fund, and of course, the budgets for councils reflect the responsibilities that they have. So I thought I'd just show you the agenda for a recent neighbourhood committee. This was actually on Wednesday. As you'll see, the first thing to notice is that it was held in a local school, not in our case, the Guildhall, not in the town hall. So very accessible to local people. The meetings, before the meeting actually starts, the neighbourhood manager gets there an hour before and holds a surgery, so people can come in and meet him and raise any issues that they want. And the first 30 minutes of the meeting is taken up with questions, when anybody can ask any questions that they like, and the councillors and council officers try to deal with them on the spot, or where necessary, promise to send them a written reply when they've done the necessary research. Now, up at the top, it talks about the running order. Items can actually be taken in a different order, and we ask any members of the public who are present to fill in a slip and pass it to the table in order to say which items they're interested in. And then in my role as when I was chair of this particular actual neighbourhood committee, I would then decide which order to take things depending on the items that people had come for. What isn't clear, though, from that bit of the agenda is that actually residents have the opportunity to speak and get involved in the discussion on virtually every item on the agenda. The only exception to that is planning applications because of the constraints that there are, the protocols that surround those. But on all others, they can speak. You'll notice if you look down the agenda, there's an opportunity to present petitions, and that's often the way in which a problem is identified. After item 3, the planning applications, is a further couple of items which are planning consultations. And these were 2 items which were of a larger scope and were going to be referred to the Central Development Control Committee, but they first came to the neighbourhood for consultation. And on those items, residents are welcome to join in the conversation. So a view is put forward on those items and that's sent on. We're fortunate in having, maybe not so fortunate in having a theme park right in the neighbourhood, which produces some very interesting planning applications, reptile houses and huge rides, which we discuss. I learnt a great deal about such things as the point at which, when somebody is going down a very fast roller coaster ride, the point at which they start screaming, because that determines whether the noise from the park would go over the tree line and impact on local residents. So very interesting stuff I've learned. Note item 7, which was about a junction improvement, which actually I'll be coming on to in a moment. Just to underline one more thing, the picture at the top is of that neighbourhood committee meeting in a community hall, and you can see that the councillors are all sitting in a row facing the residents. They are talking to the residents and being talked to by them. Officers are also on that, the neighbourhood manager in particular is also sitting on that table but out of view in that photo. And see what that says about participation compared with a fairly typical and rather grand council chamber, where the public is probably relegated to a gallery and the councillors are sitting and talking to each other, not to the public. So once again at that point, does anybody have any comments or questions that they'd like to bring into the discussion?
We have a question from Sally Hammond, which she sent to me via the chat. She asks, what is the councillor role in education of local citizens? For example, explaining why a hospital closure might be a good idea, even though very unpopular. How can a councillor best reconcile the need for re-election when it does not sit easy with doing the best or right thing?
Yes, that is the perennial problem, especially for a councillor in a controlling group on the council. I think it's absolutely essential. It's vital that councillors are instrumental in explaining to local residents through whatever means they can the constraints that affect a decision. Sometimes these are simply to do with other more important priorities. Sometimes they're to do with external constraints from central government. Sometimes they're because even though people have been fully consulted about an issue, it's clear that there are very different views out there, and whichever one you choose, somebody else will not like it. So yeah, it's really important that councillors do that. And they have their own means of messaging, of course, through their own leaflets, but they should also ensure that the council itself is putting out press releases and is informing the public, and obviously in a non-political way, about the reasons why a particular decision is made. Best versus right. Sometimes the best thing and the right thing to do is not the popular thing to do. But that's what politics is about. That's why we're in it.
Mary, this is Simon here. Could I just pick up on that point and go back to a point that you made earlier about well-run public engagement processes not leading to confrontation? And there seems to me to be a little bit of a tension here between kind of doing the right thing, not the popular thing, and not having confrontation. There's clearly a difference between kind of having confrontation, which can be very unproductive, and surfacing conflict. And I just wonder what your view is. I mean, there's a worry that if what you go for is consensus, then you take the politics out of it. So I just wonder how you resolve that tension between kind of consensus and therefore taking politics out.
I think, consensus doesn't take politics out, but because I think the politics here is about the method. And again, I'll be looking at some methods later on. I like the idea of a deliberative consultation process. So simply putting out a document to the residents saying, here are the two choices, tick this box or that box, actually hardens views. That's not a good way of doing participation. But a process which involves everybody who's interested in debate and discussion and a deeper understanding of what the issues are and how they're going to impact on other people actually can lead to consensus amongst the residents. Now, although there of course are the great showpiece decisions that are made in councils, which are made because of political ideology, political commitment, but to be honest, those are fairly infrequent. The nitty-gritty stuff that residents are involved with is how to make my road safer, and how to improve a park, where political ideology, as I say, doesn't play a role except in terms of a commitment to a particular way of carrying out that engagement. Does that make sense, Simon?
It does make sense, yes. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself again. Yes, that does make sense. Thanks.
Right, have we got anybody else?
We've just had one more question through from Tom Barrett over the chat, so I'll just read that out quickly. He says, if decisions are delegated to area committees, what accountability is there for those decisions? Does central overview and scrutiny get to call in decisions of area committees, or do you have local scrutiny arrangements? One risk of this seems to be adding additional layers of bureaucracy which require officer support. How can that be avoided, and what arguments can be made for the benefits of this over the costs?
Yes, thank you. First on the call-in issue, yes, any decision at a neighbourhood can be called in, and that has indeed happened on one of the decisions I'll be showing you later that I was involved in. In fact, it's not a case of additional layers and additional officer time, because the same number of decisions are being made as would have been done in a more centralized system. It's just they're being done in a different place and at a different time. So by, as I mentioned, by having planning applications dealt with at neighbourhoods, it meant that the time spent by the central planning authority, the Development Control Committee, is greatly reduced because they only deal with the very large applications, not with the smaller ones. So we didn't find that this was a more costly approach, and the advantages, as I hope I have shown and will show, was that you actually get better decision making, you get more involvement from local councillors, and you get a happier electorate. Does that answer what you wanted to know, Tom?
Tom says yes over the chat, and thanks. Just
okay.
One more comment or question from Sally Hammond. She says,
yep.
How comfortable would most politicians be with replacing the top picture with one in which residents and councillors sit in circles or cabaret style, with the councillors and residents seeking to identify problems and potential solutions together in full collaboration?
Sorry, the question was how comfortable are councillors with that?
Yes, how comfortable would most politicians be?
Yeah. Our experience was that once people had tried it, they loved it. Councillors really enjoyed it. As I told you, there was opposition from the other group in our council when this was introduced, but within a couple of years they got the point and were only too happy to support it and develop it. So I think once they've seen what it does, now how it helps their profile, if for no other reason, they're usually very happy with it.
Although, Mary, I think the question might actually be slightly different, although it's good to know. Well, no, that's fine. The question is more kind of, at the moment the picture shows people behind a table, the councillors behind a table. I think the question was more, do you think councillors would be comfortable sitting in a circle or kind of sitting with residents and working together?
Oh, absolutely. And some examples I'll show you is that is what happens in different kinds of contexts. For that actual committee meeting like that, there is a, it's set up in that way. Clearly, councillors have a lot of paperwork in front of them, but the point is that they are talking directly to the residents, not so much to each other, although obviously some conversations like that happen. But yes, it depends entirely on the style of meeting, the size of the meeting, and I will show some other examples in a moment. Sorry I misunderstood that. It was about layout, wasn't it? In fact, having said that, although I'm talking about neighbourhoods, all the committees in at Kingston use a layout in which the councillors are facing the public. We have public participation in all meetings apart from full council, and they're fortunate in Kingston in having a flexible council chamber which does not have fixed seating, so that the arrangements can be laid out however the chair of that committee wants it to be. And it's normally, the normal arrangement is for the councillors to be sitting in a horseshoe with the officers, and the open end of the horseshoe is where the public are seated, so that there can be direct conversation between them. Okay, shall I move on? Oh, yep.
Any more comments or questions? I don't think there are at the moment, so yep, let's move on.
Well, I'll move on to task groups, which is central really to this approach. This is where officers, councillors and residents all get involved in the project cycle. So suppose a problem's been identified. The way that it will start is that there will be, all the interested parties will be contacted. For example, the residents in a street where something is having some impact, or an interest group like young people. They will all be contacted and invited to a kick-off meeting, and during which, depending on how many people turn up, how big the issue is, they will often be divided into small groups, given maps and other techniques for identifying exactly what the problems are and to come up with some suggested solutions. At that meeting, people will be asked to volunteer to be on a task group, and the task group will then do a lot of work. And again, on the task group, there will be officers, councillors and residents, and there's usually an attempt to make sure that the residents are as representative as they can be, either geographically or in terms of or whatever factor is relevant, they will be fully briefed on the issues by the officers. They'll be briefed on all the constraints and feasible solution. The task group then carries out the consultation, which in the terms of maybe an issue around a particular street will mean that they may actually go around knocking on doors, asking people for their views, getting direct feedback from them, and it's the task group that will come up with a recommendation. The recommendation will then go to a neighbourhood committee, and as we've seen at neighbourhood committees, residents are invited along anyway and can participate in the discussion, and a decision is then taken. The decision is taken by the councillors, technically, but often it's the decision that is emerging from the consultation and from the participants that will actually be what happens. And I'll give you a few examples of how task groups have worked. This is the Hook Road, Elm Road junction that was mentioned in the committee agenda I showed you just now, which is at the corner of a group of streets. And a few years ago we set up a task group to look at the traffic problems in the surrounding roads, of which this is the corner. There were narrow roads, they were difficult to park, difficult to drive through, and there was this rather busy main road along one edge. So went through that process, letters to all the residents, invited to a meeting. They sat down in groups with maps. We set up the task group. The task group had lots of ideas, including at one point a one-way system along part of some of the roads, restricted parking, and particularly improvements to the junction in the photo. It turned out to be quite an instructive exercise, because what emerged was that any solution in one road would have an impact on another road. And we had sitting in this group residents from each of those roads involved. And they were looking face to face at each other and saying, but if you do that in your road, if you have a one-way system in your road or some kind of barrier, actually it's going to make it worse in my road. And by talking through these issues in this deliberative way, the ideas were changed. And the final outcome, believe it or not, was actually for almost minimal changes. So initially the thought had been, and indeed the traffic engineer's proposal was to do something quite radical around this area. The residents all came up and said, actually, it's better to leave it as it is with some tweaks here and there. So this went through the process, went back to the neighbourhood committee who discussed it again. However, a particular problem here on the corner that you see was not resolved. And that's because the road in front of you is managed by Transport for London, and this meant we had an extra tier of government to go up through, and it was very difficult to get funding from them and agreement to do anything to improve the junction. And then someone we all knew was killed, crossing in front of a lorry like the one you see there. And that finally triggered action from Transport for London, and the report that went to the neighbourhood committee on Wednesday that you saw in that agenda was actually proposing a pedestrian control crossing at that very point where you can see it, and the funding's available for that. So that was an outcome there. Another project was funding for a playground. This was in a site in a park which is actually some way from homes, so very few residents were actually affected. And a very interesting company was brought in to develop this that specialised in playscapes, sort of landscaped play areas, and they were very much into public participation, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to work with them. They worked with young people through the local schools and the youth clubs, since it was the young people who were the going to be the potential users, and they were the interest group. So they worked with those young people and with the ward councillors. Between them they identified the kinds of activities they'd like to do in this place, including a zip wire, which you can just see in the background, and also the skate bowl. Contacted local skateboarders and the BMX clubs, and they helped to design this bowl, and it proved to be very, very popular, actually. And they effectively, the young people themselves, effectively manage the skate bowl area themselves. And I've been terribly impressed watching them in the safe way in which they use this facility. All right, this is another project I got involved with. This idea was started by ward councillors. In fact, to be precise, it was me and my husband, who was also a councillor. We came up with the idea of campaigning to replace this really rotty library and an out-of-date community hall with a new building. And so we campaigned heavily on this and eventually were able to get some funding through an adult learning fund, in fact, to rebuild it. So we did quite a major consultation with the local residents in the immediate neighbourhood and through schools, and established the priorities for this project. They included a library, of course, another community hall, a smaller one, a learning centre, and toilets. That was top of everybody's list, actually, because this is an area without public toilets, and we wanted to have, everybody wanted to have somewhere where they could pop in during normal opening hours. And they wanted a cafe as well. And in fact, the design that we came up with, and most importantly, something to keep young people off the streets. That was expressed differently depending on whether you were talking to the residents or the young people themselves, but that was effectively what they wanted. So when it was opened 3 or 4 years ago, it included a beautiful library, a community hall, a learning centre for adult education, mainly computer-based, a creche, children's centre, a lovely cafe, a council information point where anybody can go in and get information on council services, other toilets, of course, and, bottom right, a recording studio. The facility for young people was not what people were expecting. Young people aren't that interested in traditional youth clubs these days, but somewhere where a band can go and rehearse, perform, record, was very, very popular, and it acts also during the daytime as a support for all secondary schools and indeed the primary schools in anything they wish to do around music technology. Lots of community activities going on, craft fairs, photographic competitions, quizzes, and very popular with young people, bringing in a manga artist, you know, those Japanese anime cartoons, to get young people to learn the skills. And in fact, in just a boast here, in 2007, the Library Council presented the library with a major national award, describing it as the heart of the community. And I would say that it met that requirement because the consultation with local residents and with potential users had been so thorough. Very quickly, something we've all been involved in, I'm sure, consultations around schools. We were lucky to get some money under the Building Schools for the Future programme just before it was pulled. Here, the important thing was, from the neighbourhood point of view, was the consultation with the residents nearby, particularly around the impact of the building programme itself. Task group set up, once again, in the same way, regular newsletter out to residents. And they also fed in some very good ideas, particularly about some of the community use of the building, which has happened since. Of course, the pupils were consulted as well, and one of the outcomes of that is the design of the loos. You might just be able to see a little blue figure, which is a boy on the wall in the distance, and a red figure, which seems to have dropped off. Those are the entrances to the loos for the younger pupils, and they've been designed in such a way to reduce bullying, because that was the key issue that came back from the school pupils, was they wanted bullying designed out so that someone can stand near the entrance, a teacher can stand and can see all the children in the wash bowl area, and they've only used cubicles on the boys' side so that they can have privacy, obviously, and the pupils love it. And the same with the corridors. The corridors, as you can see, are very visible as they go around the building, so again, to avoid any dark corners where bullying might be carried out. Just a quick look at something on the council website, slightly out of date this one, but it was a consultation around another school, and all the papers, I just happened to find this one because I was involved in it. In fact, you'll find my name there if you look closely. All the papers, all the data was published in a public way, so anybody could have a look at it and share it. The working group in this case, as you can see, was made up of residents, businesses, because there was a small shopping parade nearby, ward councillors, and governors from the school and council officers, a very broad group who sat down and worked through some of the issues, because this school was enlarging and people were concerned about traffic and the use of the roads and safety issues. And finally in this section is about street meetings. And this takes engagement literally right down to street level. We use the same process for a very small project. For example, there was a small cul-de-sac who put in a petition asking to have some better layout of the road so there could be more parking. There are only 12 houses, but every house in that cul-de-sac signed the petition. Now, I know a lot of councils that wouldn't get over the threshold for taking seriously. In Kingston, all petitions are looked at seriously and assessed in relation to the number of people who might be involved. So in this case, the whole road wanted to do something. So similar problems in other roads where there are concerns about fire access because of parking. These awkward things, awkward situations where you have to balance safety against the need to have somewhere to park your car. Once again, everybody called to a meeting, but this time in the road, literally on the road. Officers there, councillors there, and the residents. And we just walk around. We walked around, looked at what the issues are, pointed out particular curbs, particular issues. So there was a very real sense of what the problem was and how it could be improved. On the back of that, the traffic engineer would send out a consultation leaflet to everybody saying, well, look, this is a possible solution, get back some feedback back on that. And if there were particular issues that needed resolving, back on the street again, looking at what was going on. And then that would then get reported back to neighbourhood, and the decision would have effectively been taken by the street. And only this week there was a nice headline in the local press, Democracy in Action, over plans. And this is exactly the same neighbourhood again, which again used a street meeting to actually come up with a solution, which was not just a majority decision. The important thing here is not just to do the majority decision, but to do a decision which actually does not inconvenience anybody and takes note of people with special requirements such as disabled access. So, but by getting everybody together, people generally want to come up with a solution like that, not just one which is liked by 60% of the population but hated by 40%. That's what I meant about working towards consensus. But it's working because people are talking to each other and their neighbours. And of course in face-to-face meetings they're much more careful about wanting to be sympathetic towards other people, which you don't always get when people are simply putting their views down on a bit of paper and not able to listen to other people. I wonder if anybody wants to say anything at that point. Is there have any comments waiting to come in?
There's no more comments via the chat. If anybody would like to make a comment, then put your hand up and I'll unmute you.
Okay, well I'll move on, but if you want to come in at any point, please do. The final bit you'll be glad to hear that I want to talk about are community panels. This arose out of some work we were doing around a neighbourhood policy. Every year the neighbourhood committee comes up with a policy statement, and generally speaking this was developed by the councillor and then agreed at a neighbourhood committee meeting. I wanted very much to have much more involvement from residents in coming up with the priorities for the neighbourhood. And it was at this point that I brought Involve in to help us with getting a process that would work. So we've set up a community panel, which is basically email-based, and within that a community steering group, which is of people who are happy to put extra time into it. They are the people who have come up with the proposals for neighbourhood priorities and policy. They do that by holding an annual meeting to which they invite anybody who wants to come along, which again goes through a fairly familiar process of identifying priorities, finding out which are the ones that are most important. Eventually that the recommendations are put to the neighbourhood committee and they agree them, and then at each neighbourhood committee meeting progress against those priorities is on the agenda, that is marked and discussed. I'm perfectly aware that when I was chair of the neighbourhood there was just no way I could be reaching out to all 25,000 residents in the neighbourhood. And it's misleading to imagine that we can. Even as within my ward, I can only knock on so many doors over a period of time. And some people, of course, are always out. Excuse me. So although we publicised meetings as much as possible, and anybody was welcome to come along, we also worked very closely with all the local organisations that we could identify, who themselves were probably opinion formers in the area. Civil society in general, so it would be faith groups, sports organisations, support groups, local charities, social enterprises, environmental groups, social groups, meeting groups. We contacted all of those and asked them to please send people along to the panel and to act as the conduit for information back to the people that they represented. And I think in the absence of a town forum where we could hold every single resident in the neighbourhood, I think this is a very good way of getting the local community closely involved with what the local priorities are. And this is a neighbourhood newsletter which is widely distributed about once a quarter, and this particular one is advertising the neighbourhood community plan event and inviting people along to it. Given my background in e-democracy, I have made a couple of comments here about online channels. When I started off in, well, I was chairing the National Project for Local E-Democracy from the year 2002. It was all a new area. Now everyone does it. So I'm just picking up a couple of points which are worth picking up. I'm assuming that the council has a website. Not all councils did 10 years ago. Puts out email newsletters, hopefully has online petitions, is using Facebook and maybe Twitter. That councillors in many cases will have personal websites or will be using other social media. Just to show you the council website here, just there's a lot of interactive stuff there. You can put in your postcode and find out all sorts of things about your area, planning applications, who your councillors are, when your bins are next going to be collected, all that stuff which is good information on which people can assess, on which they can identify whether there are issues that need further development. A quick look at our petitioning system. Kingston was the first local council in the country to have an online petitioning system based on a well-established petitioning system that we had already. And that was, again, something that came out of the national project I was working on. But to quickly move on, a quick view of one of the councillors and their personal website, and just to show how that is linked from the council website. I'd have a look at the text there, because one of the issues I remember having to deal with for a long time is council officers who felt they couldn't link to political material. And in fact, it's been well established now that provided you put a disclaimer of some sort, there's no problem at all with doing so. Quick look at the same neighbourhood committee and its Facebook page, which is managed by the neighbourhood manager. And a thought to end with. So we have about 10 minutes left, so comments and questions, I think, on anything would be welcome.
We've had one question just come in from Matt Clack over the chat. He says, how do residents on the community panel identify the priorities? Are there checks against personal interests? For example, is other information used, complaints data, public sector organisation performance information, etc.? Working with local meeting groups is a great way of reaching wider audiences, but raises the issue mentioned last week about community gatekeepers.
So the question was, were the suggestions that came from the community panel and indeed the open meeting, were they simply taken as is? No, it was the role of the neighbourhood manager to take those suggestions and do some initial research on them, on the lines that you've said, and then come back to the community steering group, which is the residents group, and work on it so that they had something that they could present to the neighbourhood committee that was feasible, legal, and relevant. Does that answer your question, Matt?
He says yes. Another question has come through from Sally Hammond. Do you think the move to self-regulation and self-improvement for councils has any impact on the role of councillors and how they engage with their communities?
That's a very interesting question. It should, of course it should. The reason I'm pausing is because I have always worked in a context of a council which has been very committed to engagement. I'm trying to understand what would be the triggers for more that would lead to councillors being more involved in other councils where perhaps they haven't got that culture. In fact, it was one of my mantras when we were doing all the work around e-democracy, that actually getting councils to think about some new e-democracy tools was quite a subtle way of getting them to think about participation in general. I'm not sure whether that answers your question, Sally.
We just had another question come through from Emma Mould. Sally has just said, yes, it's a good insight. But the question from Emma Mould is the duty to involve definitely going to be scrapped? If so, how much priority and resources do you think councils are likely to devote to involvement?
Well, I'd hate to think that the intentions of central government would override any good practices that people want to develop locally. If they want to engage and are convinced that's the right thing, then of course they should do it. I don't think it needs a duty imposed on people to make them do it. There's enough willingness to do it already, as I understand it, but I know that's not true everywhere. And if there is a duty and there's no motivation to do it, then it'll only be done grudgingly anyway, won't it?
Mary, can I just come in there and just say that I've just sent a link to Tim and he'll forward it on to everybody. But the duty was actually scrapped in 2011 and it was replaced by Department of Community and Local Government by Best Value Statutory Guidance, which is a much shorter document that compiled a range of other duties as well. So I've just sent something to Tim who will forward that round.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Would anybody else like to come in with a question or comment? If you'd like to put your hand up, then you can ask it yourself, or else if you're quick you can type one in the chat to me and I'll read it out for you.
Well, Mary, I think that looks like that might be it. Thank you very much indeed. It was extremely invaluable to get the view on the ground, but had a real sense of how the council works together, and found it particularly interesting kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of structures in particular and how those structures work. That may show my own bias about how important institutions are, but I think you've also shown that at least I was reading into what you were saying, the importance of the culture of the overall council itself, and how important the individual members, both councillors and officers, were in making all of these structures and institutions work. I guess what I was hearing, a subtext I was hearing, was that the institutions themselves aren't the only thing. It's also about how you use them. I was also struck. I've been tweeting whilst you've been talking. I think you're probably quite lucky to have a council chamber where the seats are movable, so that you can actually do this. Churchill said of the chamber of the House of Commons that the institutions that we live and work in shape us as much as we shape them, and I think you're very lucky.
Absolutely.
And I guess that many councils will struggle there to be able to be quite so flexible. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you also to everybody who took part and for your questions. And if you want to follow, go and look at the hashtag. You can see my tweets and join in and disagree with anything I said. Mary, anything you'd like to just finish up with before we say goodbye?
Yes, interested of that comment you just made. Actually, I'll just come back on that comment about the council chambers. There's nothing to stop you actually holding your council meetings in a school hall, is there? We get very wedded to buildings when we need to be wedded to people in local government.
That's a very good. That's a really good good thing to end on. I think from when we think about public engagement, that's exactly right. Thank you all very much. And the next webinar will be happening in a couple of weeks' time. I'm right, aren't I, Tim? And
yes, you are.
Sending around details. So thank you all very much. Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And it's it's quite strange to be doing this in a slightly disembodied way, so I'm just going to stop now, even though it feels like it's not quite right to stop.